Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Kate from the National World War II Museum here in New Orleans, Louisiana. And thank you today for joining us for this special program in honor of Yom HaShoah that was supposed to be using the recorded oral history testimony of Eva Schloss, a Holocaust survivor. But I actually have a surprise for you guys. You may notice that there is someone else on this Zoom call with me, and it's not a PowerPoint slide, but it is Miss Eva Schloss herself. She is actually able to join us today all the way from London. So it's evening her time, afternoon my time. And so before I turn it over to her, to tell her story, I just wanted to remind everyone this program is being recorded and it will be uploaded to our museum's YouTube page later today. And of course, it is a webinar, so we can't hear or see you guys, even though we know you're there in your classrooms. But at the end, we're going to take a few audience questions from Eva. So if you have a question, while she is presenting, go ahead and type it in the Q&A button. If you don't see the Q&A, if you move your mouse, it should pop up, and we will answer a few of those questions after she has told her story. And again, those of you who are just joining, thank you. And we are actually, and I'm very excited, I've gotten to know her just a little bit before we went live, today all the way from London, Eva Schloss, a Holocaust survivor. And so I'm going to turn it over to her so she can tell us her story. And again, if you have a question that you'd like to ask her, go ahead and type it in the Q&A. So hello, Eva, and thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure. Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to talk to you today, and I hope you learn from it, because it is very important. I do it because unfortunately we have to change a lot of things still in our world, and I hope through my experience, which was pretty difficult to go through, and through meeting people who don't know anything about it, it is very important for me to carry on talking as long as I possibly can. Next month I'll be 92 years old, but I still travel, I still talk, because it is something very, very important. So here we go. It will be some things is very nice, some things is easy to understand, other things are really very hard and unbelievable that people can do things like that to each other. So I was born in 1929 in Vienna, which is Austria, which is a beautiful city. Used to be a big empire, Austria, and it became very small after the First World War. But nevertheless, it was from all over Europe. People came there to study, to learn. It was art and music and theater. It was very, very full of culture and life, and as well, very nice scenery. It had lots of lakes and mountains, and our family had lived there for many, many generations, and it was idyllic. I had young parents. My parents married. My mother was 18. My father was 21. Then my older brother was born, Heinz. And 3 years later, I was born. And we had cousins. And yeah, it was, I couldn't have wished something better. And but we were Jewish, which didn't matter. At that time, they were mainly, Austria was a Catholic country, so there were, most of people were Catholics, and quite a big Jewish population as well. So there were no Muslims at the time, or Oriental people, you know, that in the 30s that was really, traveling was not such a popular thing. So, and So I tell you a little bit about how nice we had it. I was very into sport, like my dad, and my brother was much more careful with, and my mother. And so I usually went with my dad in the morning. We went out with a backpack into the mountains, and in winter we went skiing. And at the weekends we were always as a family together. Our grandparents lived around the corner. We were very, very close to them. So I was a very, very happy child. And then, unfortunately, in 1938, so that was, I was just 9 years old, the Nazis with Hitler went without permission, just marched into Austria, and the Nazis took over. That was very amazing because people said, we want to be independent. But as soon as Hitler's army marched in, people stood in the street with their big swastika flags and with a Heil Hitler salute, and life changed from one day to the next. My best friend was a little Catholic girl, and after school, we walked to school. It was very near. On the way home, I usually stopped off there, and we had a few cookies and a little talk still. But the day after Hitler marched in, I still went with her. And when the mother saw me, I could see she was very cross. She said, we never want to see you here again. And she slammed the door in my face. I was shocked. I didn't understand. I went home crying. I said to my mother, we didn't have a row. We were okay. And so my mother said, well, for Jewish people, life is going to change from now on. It will be very difficult. My brother Heinz, the next day, he came home and he looked terrible. His clothes were torn, blood was everywhere on him, his face and his clothes and everywhere, and he was crying. And my parents said, what happened? What have you done, Heinz? And he cried again, and he said, my own friends did that, and the teachers just watched and let it happen. So can you imagine how suddenly we felt, what is going on? We couldn't understand. Of course, our parents knew because in Germany, Hitler had been in power already several years. And but Austria didn't want to have anything to do with the Nazis. But anyways, that's how it changed. And we were eventually, can't tell you too much detail because a lot to tell, we were able to get out. But, you know, Hitler was in Germany in 1933 already in power, and the anti-Semitism, of course, had started. And many, many people, Jewish people, left the country. That was still possible at the time. But so by 1938 and 39, most countries, and this is a terrible crime, didn't want any more Jews. They knew they might be killed, but they said, oh no, we have already enough Germans here. We don't want any more people. So it was very difficult. You had to have a visa, an exit visa and an entry visa. And it was difficult to obtain that. So my father actually, the parents knew something like this might happen, had planned something like that, but never talked to the children about it, not to frighten us. So, and he had a shoe factory, which he had inherited from his father. And he had connections in Holland, business connections. And as soon as Hitler marched in, he escaped to Holland, to this south of Holland, to this shoe factory. And he had planned, obviously, that he might get a job there because he was very clever with new models and things like that. So, and he said, well, as soon as I can, I send for you. But that became impossible. So eventually, after a year and a half, where we had a very, very difficult time in Austria, in Vienna, we got a visa to go into Belgium, which was next to Holland. So, but we were not allowed to leave the country because Hitler wanted to kill all the Jews, so he didn't want them to leave. So we escaped in the night. Somebody helped us across the border, and we went to Belgium. And Belgium is a French-speaking country. I didn't speak the language, but refugees was not something which existed at the time. You know, people stayed in their own country. And so they looked at me, who is this child who don't understand what we are saying? So I felt a real outsider. It took me a long time to get to know the language, made a few friends, and then it was my birthday. And I asked, we lived in a boarding house. We were not allowed to take anything, just a little suitcase with a few of our clothes, nothing else. So we had, of course, my mother had no household. So we lived in a boarding house where other lodgers were living. And I asked this lady if I could bring a few friends. And she said, yes, 4 or 5 girls you can bring. And I gave them an invitation, and they also were looking forward to come. And the day of my birthday, they all brought a letter from their parents that they are not allowed to come. You know, I was 10 years old, and I was very upset. Why can't my friends come to play with me? I'm just like them, a little girl. And I went home crying again, and my mother said, well, she just want to have anything to do with Jewish refugees. So life was not very good. And in the meantime, Hitler became more and more powerful. He went into other countries, Czechoslovakia and Poland, and the Second World War was declared. So it was war now. So my father was still in Holland, and we were in Belgium. How can we ever get together? So my father tried again and again to get a visa for us. And eventually we got a visa in 1940 to visit my father for 3 months. So we went, but again, we had nothing. So my father took a hired apartment, fully furnished, and was very nice. It was on an open square called the Merwedeplein. I mentioned that, but because if ever later you go to Holland, you have to visit that, because on this square lived a very famous little girl. She wasn't famous at the time, but have you heard of the name Anne Frank? I'm sure you've heard. She lived as well in this square opposite our house. And if you live in an apartment, you have no yards to play in. So after school, all the children came up to this open square and played together, met together, gossiped, and so on. We did hopscotch and skipping and marbles, play with marbles. That was very, very popular. And my brother, he was at the time 14. He was very, very musical. In Vienna, he had learned already piano, and he got a guitar in Belgium. And in this furnished house was a piano. So he was very, very happy he could play again. And with the guitar, he stood outside and all the kids came around and we sang and we danced. It was lovely. We were all very, very happy. Of course, it was still difficult because I didn't know really Dutch, but I picked it up quite quickly. But again, the happiness didn't last long. So that was February, and in May, one night, we heard aeroplanes and we saw these lights trying to catch the aeroplanes, and we put on the radio and it says, very bad news, the Germans are trying to invade our country. But don't worry, we are going, Holland is under sea level and that has dikes. And in the First World War, they opened some of the dikes and flooded some of the country. So the Germans just bypassed it in the First World War. But the war had changed. There were aeroplanes now. They didn't have to land. They just came with parachutes and landed behind the waterline. And as well, that was the first time that a civilian city, innocent people, nothing to do with war, were bombed. Big city, Rotterdam, with a big harbor, 10,000 casualties, people died, and the news came out, if you're not going to surrender, we are going to bomb all your cities. Well, the government can't accept that, of course. And the royal family escaped to Canada, which was not very helpful for the population to carry on fighting. So within 5 days, they made peace with the Nazis. We still tried to escape to England with a boat because there's a harbor there, but it was too late. So we went back to our apartment and realized, well, now we are caught. We'll see what happens now. And nothing happened. So we said, oh, well, that's okay. But the Nazis had to organize themselves. They brought the Nazi head of the government. And slowly, the measures against the Jewish people started to be on the radio, in the newspapers. Leaflets were stuck on the walls, and it became difficult. But not life-threatening like in Austria or Germany. We were not allowed to go to the cinema, not to swimming pools. We had to be in at 8 o'clock. Then we had to go not to Christian shop, only to Jewish shop to do shopping, which they didn't supply very much. So we started to be short of food and other things. And so every week there was new measures. And then we had to wear a yellow star on our garment when we went outside, which means that everybody, when you walk there, knows you are a Jew. And it happened that especially young men were just arrested and disappeared, and they were never ever seen again. So you can imagine it became very scary, especially for men, my father and my brother Heinz. And it was not anymore nice. We were not allowed on public transport. We had to hand in our bicycles. So, we were really cut off from the world. And hand in our radios, or we didn't know what was going on. So really bad. So that was for 2 years. And then 10,000 young people got a call-up notice, including my brother, who was 16, and Anna's older sister, Margot, 16 as well, to report in a week with a backpack, and they gave a list what they had to bring to be deported to Germany to work in German factories. So that was 1942. We knew already that in Germany, all the Jews had been arrested and taken to death camps. Death camps. Well, we still had the radio, the BBC, the British Broadcast Corporation, like your American broadcast. Just me. Sent out the news. You were not, even Christian people were not allowed to listen to foreign radio, only Dutch and German. But the BBC then broadcast out in all the different language to all the different countries. By that time, in 1942, Hitler had conquered the whole of Europe. Only Sweden and Switzerland was not occupied. But all the other countries in Europe, which was a lot, at least 10, 12 countries, were under the Nazis. So the BBC said, Jewish people, be careful. The Nazis have in Germany and Poland 300 death camps. And in some of those, Jewish people were systematically being gassed. Can you imagine the shock we heard when we heard that? So my father called us together after Heinz got his notice and said, Heinz, we are not going to send you, we are going into hiding. And I said, what you mean hiding? You know, children play hide and seek, but adults hiding. So he explained, I found some wonderful people, Dutch people, who going to offer their homes for us to come and stay with them. But the apartments are always very small because it's quite a densely populated country and quite small. So I couldn't find a family who wanted to take in 4 people. So we have to split up again. I will go with my mother and Heinz will go with him. And I started to cry because I was very, very close to my brother. He was a wonderful older brother. And my father explained, if we are in 2 different places, the chance that 2 of us will survive is bigger. Survive. So I was 13 years old, and that was really, I think, the first time that I realized it is a matter of life and death. I could be killed. So that's quite horrible, isn't it? So this is what happened. So we had a few days to pack up a few things, but of course we couldn't walk around with luggage to go to this hiding. So we took just a minimum of things. The same thing, Anne and her family went into hiding. And if you've read the diary, you know that she went there, and Anne put on lots of clothes so that she didn't have to carry things. And yeah, I don't think I did that, but we had a little bag and not much. And my father said, well, America's in the war already in 1942. It won't last long. By Christmas, everything will be over. So, you know, few months we can manage that. But of course it wasn't. The war was still another 3 years, and a lot of terrible things happened in this time. So we went to our secret hiding place. I can't tell you too much about it. So they're really very nice people who risk their life, because if would be found, they go as well, not to death camps, but into camps. And many of those people died as well. And if there was a resistance movement, as you can imagine, not everybody wanted to do what the Nazis were doing to them. Every country had a resistance movement. It was very, very important. And and the Nazis knew that not all those youngsters had come. So where are they? They went to their homes. Of course, the homes were empty by then. People had gone. So they were looking for them. And at night, they made house searches. They knocked on the door or rang the bell. And people, even ordinary Dutch people, had to open the door at night and let the Nazis go in and search their homes. So in all the hiding places, we had a hiding place within the hiding place. The people from the resistance came and built somewhere where they under floorboards, in a wardrobe. In our case, for instance, there was a big bathroom with a toilet, and they made a wall there so that the bathroom had no toilet, with a trap door. And then we had to go in there, sit on the toilet, and close the trap door so that they wouldn't see us. So all kind of different places. But in one place, which we heard, for instance, they came and there were people going hiding as well, and the beds were still warm. So they realized people were there, so they demolished the whole apartment till they found the Jewish people and took everybody away as well the people who owned the apartment. So people became scared, and after sometimes 6 months, after 3 months, people said, look, we can't take this tension. Every night they might come and search. You have to look for a different hiding place. That was different from the Frank family because they had this office of Otto Frank. This was slightly different. They didn't have house searches. And so we moved around 6-7 times in the 2 years we were in hiding. And then we were betrayed. It's a long, complicated story, but I just make it short. My father and brother changed as well hiding place. And my mother and me, we looked both very Dutch, blonde and blue eyes. And I missed my father and brother so much that, and you know, 2 years being separated. And I was sporty, I couldn't go out, I didn't know what to do with myself. So I was very, very miserable. So my parents decided we would take a risk and visit them from time to time. So my father said he needs a new hiding place, and my mother was in touch with the resistance and found a nice hiding place. A Dutch nurse said she had a good house where they could go. And so that was very near at the time where we were in Amsterdam. So when they moved on the Sunday, we went to visit them. And on Tuesday, it was my 15th birthday. We just sat down to breakfast. The landlord, very nice people as well, had saved an egg for me because we never got any egg or very little food at the time. A birthday egg, she said. And we were just sitting down to breakfast. It was a knock on the door in the morning, quite safe, nothing visitor or somebody delivering something. So they opened the door and the Nazis stormed in and went straight for my mother and me, because this nurse who found this house was a double agent. And when we visited, she organized that Nazis would follow us, so they knew where we were as well. So you can imagine that is a birthday I will never forget. Then they take us to the headquarters of the Nazis, and they wanted to know who had helped us, how we had got our ration books, all kinds of questions. And they beat me and beat me and beat me. And then they said, and I was in shock. I didn't say anything, I just cried because I knew I might be killed now. Can you imagine? Just 15 years old and really afraid of that's the end of my life. So, and as I say, I just couldn't speak. So they beat me, and then they said, if you don't tell us, we are going to kill your brother. So then I knew that they were arrested as well. So I started to cry, and it was terrible. So anyway, can't tell more details, but we eventually they let us go, 4 of us. We spent the night in a prison, then we were put on a transport to a local camp, a transit camp, before we were taken to the east. Because in Holland there were camps, but not that if you would have stayed there, you would have survived. But if you were transported to the east, it was very, very risky. And after a few days, we were called up to be transported to the east. So this was, you know, like a death sentence hanging over you. So there was no way out. We just went, and you might have seen pictures, not ordinary trains, but they were like goods trains, like a container. They're just huge metal trains with no windows in it, 2 big sliding doors, and about 80 people were pushed in there. They had made a little opening, a little slant on one side with a barbed wire across, but only very small, for a little bit of air, and 2 buckets, one for toilets and one for fresh water. About 80 people. Once a day it was changed. And so we were hungry, we were thirsty, it was May, it was very hot on this metal train. People fainted. We were hungry, we were disorientated because it was dark most of the time. Once a day they opened the doors and just threw chunks of bread in like you would feed animals. And but the only nice thing for me was that I was still together with my family. And Heinz told me that, and of course I told you he was a wonderful musician, But of course, he can't make any music, he had to be quiet. So he started painting. And he created some beautiful paintings, oil paintings. He told me about them. And he said, before they escaped from that woman to go to this nurse, um, they hid them under the floorboards in the house with a note on it. This belongs to Heinz and Erich Geringer. And after the war, we are going to pick it up again. And he told me with he was crying at the time. He was very, very afraid. He said, if I don't come back, Evie, said, please pick up the paintings because they're very, very valuable to me. And I said, no, no, of course you will come back. We will both come back. But anyway, so, and eventually we arrived. They didn't tell us where we were going. About 3-4 days we were traveling, and it turned out we were in Auschwitz. I'm sure you've heard the name because it was the biggest death camp in Poland. As I said, there were many, 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 but this was huge, very, very big, and it was well known that people were guests there. So you can imagine how we felt. So we were called out, we had to jump down, and there stood the Nazis with many, many Alsatian dogs who barked very furiously and guns pointing at all of us. So if you tried to run away, you know, no chance, of course. And then we had to say goodbye to the menfolk because Auschwitz was a huge complex of different camps. Auschwitz was the men camp, and then there was Birkenau, which was a women's camp, and then there were Monoway, a few camps. But at that time we were in Birkenau, and so we had to, the men were going to walk to Auschwitz. And you can imagine this goodbye we were saying to each other, knowing perhaps you will never ever see each other in this life. So people clinged to each other and cried and held on, but the Nazis came with their guns and pushed us aside and so on. And then eventually the men walked away, and then they called out all rows of 5. Everything was always rows of 5, or this way or this way. So, and then everybody came quiet, and we heard whisper, Mengele, Mengele. He was a camp doctor, a proper medical man, but he wasn't there to look after people when they were ill, but he decided who was going to live and who was going to die. So we had to stand rows of 5, and so long barrels like this, and then he came, looked you over just for a fraction of a second, and decided this side or this side, life or death. And the first miracle, because I'm here, because a few real amazing miracles happened. My mother had given in that holding camp because we arrested in the clothes we had and had nothing else. I had just a dress, had worn it already for a few weeks by then. And my mother had given by a nice person in this holding camp a hat and coat. And my mother gave it to me. She said, perhaps it comes in handy. And so this hat had a big rim. And so when Mengele looked at me, a fraction of a second, he didn't see how young I was. So I passed his first selection. Many girls of 16, 17 who were perhaps very pale from the journey, or not very strong looking or whatever, or just, you know, just young, they went to the wrong side. And babies, if a woman had a baby on her arms, it was given to a younger woman, and they had to carry it. And then if the woman was selected as well with the baby, they had to go. So it was terrible. We lost about half our Dutch transport. And then we were herded, always like cattle, quick, running into the camp. That was all outside on the platform. And the next command was undress completely naked, so hat and coat, everything. And they were collecting all this. There was a big area which was nicknamed Canada, because it was a bit better if you could work there, where all the things which was confiscated from all the transport. Can you imagine thousands of people came every day bringing things, and that was all taken away, and their own clothing. And it was shipped to Germany, to the bombed cities. But of course, we didn't know anything of this yet. But anyway, I'm dressed completely naked. Then we had to go in front of a table, had to tell us from which country we came, what jobs we had, what age we had, all kind of information. They kept particularly records of everything. And those records, a lot of it was saved, and that's how we have the proof that it really happened. Because you do know, I'm sure, that there are people who deny that the Holocaust has ever happened, that it is all Jewish fantasy. But the proof is there, definitely. So, and then when all this was done, we were tattooed, and they said to us, you're not a human being, you are like cattle with a number on your body. And if we want you, we're always going to call you out by your number. Forget you have a name. And all our hair was shaved. By that time, we looked already miserable and ugly. You can imagine, scary. And then they told, and this is what they object the most. They were young Nazi boys, who organized all this. And they told us, the people you have been separated from, who went to a different side, they didn't go to a shower. So they thought it was a shower, but it was gas coming out. It looked like a shower, but it was gas. And within 5 to 10 minutes, everybody will be dead. So you can imagine if a mother had just given up her little baby or her child. So terrible. And then we were let out, and naked still, and we walked to a big heap of clothes, and we were shown one garment, no underwear. And the next heap was shoes, 2 shoes, never a pair, and that was all we ever had. And then we were herded to our barrack, which perhaps you've seen pictures, big bunks where 8 people were sleeping, 3 high, nothing in it, no blanket, no straw, no pillow, nothing, just on the boards. The only thing which was in it was bed lice and head lice, and also a little bug which sucked your blood, and when you push them away, it makes wound. So within a few weeks, we were all full with wounds, and terrible. Every day we had to walk from early morning to late at night, got very little food, and it became winter. It was freezing cold. We had still only one garment. We were full of lice. Rats were there. Washing was impossible. We were only allowed twice a day to a toilet, which in the barrack were no toilets. You had to walk 10 minutes. A lot of people had diarrhea. A lot of people died, of course, from dysentery, typhus, cholera, and the rest from starvation. So that anybody survives those camps is a miracle. But my mother and me were the lucky ones. And then in January, the Russians came. But the Germans, we didn't know, of course, but the Germans knew, and they started to evacuate the camps. It took every day thousands of people who were still alive, but very, very weak, out, and they disappeared. We didn't know what happened. After the war, those were called the death marches, because you can imagine those weak people in the middle of winter walking days couldn't make it. So, but again, by some luck, really luck, my mother and me didn't go, and so we were liberated by the Russians. So we were there 9 months, and there were times when I had nearly given up, but because I had most of the time, there were so many more miracles, which unfortunately I haven't got time to tell you, but we too survived. And then, of course, And we went with the Russians, and because the war wasn't finished, that was January, war didn't finish till May. And they took us out of the war zone and they transported us deep, deep into Russia. We were till May, so from February, beginning of February till May, we were traveling. Because, you know, there was fighting going on and the Russians had to go to the front, and so our train was stopped again. And eventually we ended up in Odessa. Very interesting to look it up on a map, this huge journey. And there we arrived in May, and there we survived the end of the war. And then we had to have a long journey through the Mediterranean, which was beautiful then, of course, in the summer, back to France and then up to Holland, where we arrived in June. And there we waited for news of our family. And Anna Frank's father was they were arrested in August 44 and sent as well to Auschwitz. And in Auschwitz, I met her father, and he traveled with us, but he didn't know anything about his girls or his wife. And we didn't know anything about my father and my brother. And so in Amsterdam, we waited for news, and eventually that came with a letter from the Red Cross saying that my father and my brother had perished in another camp in Austria, in Mauthausen, a week before the American army came to liberate that camp. So I was heartbroken, and my mother, of course, well. And Otto Frank, of course, got the same news that both his girls and his wife had died. One day he came to us and had a little parcel under his arm, and he said, it's amazing what I've got. I think you can guess what it was. It was Anna's diary. And that gave him a purpose in living, because before that he came to us very often and they said, I have nothing in my life, no family, no home, nothing, only the clothes I've got on my body. But once he had the diary, he got a new life back. And so I remembered, you know, through all those what happened to me, I'd forgotten about Heinz's painting. So I said to my mother, we must look for Heinz's painting. And indeed, we did find them, and I got them back. And they're really wonderful. And if you look in books and so, you can see, you will find pictures of it. Because I've written many things about it. And there's as well a book coming out and a Zoom play coming out about his life and all kinds of things. So keep an eye out for that. And, you know, I was more miserable after I realized that life will never ever be back how it used to be than I was in the camp. Because in the camp I had to use all my strength, all my concentration, all my willpower to survive. But then I thought, well, if we have never a family anymore, I really wanted to commit suicide. Of course, I didn't do it, thank God, but I felt more depressed outside later on than I was in the camp, because I had a purpose, I had to survive. And eventually, and I was full of hatred, as you can imagine. And so, you know, if you hate people, you're a very miserable person. And I was very, very, very miserable. And then Otto Frank came very often to our house, and my mother cooked him a meal, and we talked about things. And he had no hatred, and I couldn't understand that. And then when I didn't know, when I finished school, I didn't know what I was going to do. I couldn't really care. And Otto and my mother decided I should become a photographer. And I was quite artistic, so I said, okay, but I didn't really, my heart wasn't in it. And so I was unhappy in Amsterdam, so it's a lovely city. And but at the time I had too many memories there. And so I went to London for a year, and as an apprentice in a photographic studio. And I met a young man in a boarding house where I lived, And we both didn't have any money, and we went for walks. And after 6 months, he said to me, Eva, I've fallen in love with you. I was 21. And when we are, and he was studying economics. When I'm finished studying, we can get married and start a new life. I come from Israel, he said, and we can start a new life in Israel. And I said, no, thank you. And he was a bit upset about that, but he thought, well, I will change my mind. I said, that was the first time I told him I had a widowed mother in Amsterdam. And you can imagine, I was very, very close with my mother. I couldn't imagine I would just get married and leave her on her own. So, and Otto Frank, he kept an eye on me. Sometimes he came to London and I told him that, and he got a bit embarrassed and he said, well, your mother and me have fallen in love while you were away. And when you get married a year later, we would like to get married as well. So I went back to this young man and said, well, we can marry now, which he was very happy, which we did. We went in 1952 to Amsterdam back to get married. And Otto and my mother married in a year later in 1953. So that's why they say I'm Anne Frank's stepsister. So of course she was not alive at the time. But Otto really considered me like a daughter to him. And we were married 63 years with my husband, and we have 3 daughters and 5 grandchildren. So life is already for many years, of course, back to normality. But the one thing I felt is my duty to tell people about my experience so that it will never, ever happen again. After the war, many people said, never again Auschwitz. We've learned our lesson. From now on, there will be harmony, peace, no discrimination. But unfortunately, that is not true. There's a lot of wars, a lot of prejudice, where, you know, anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim, anti-Mexican, anti-this, anti-that. And this has to stop. We are just one race, a human race. We are all equal, and we have to help each other and respect each other for who we are. So, as I say, I had to shorten a lot of things, but I've written 3 books. They're all available on Amazon. Eva's Story is my first book, then The Promise, that is about my brother. And a few years later, I wrote After Auschwitz. It is not only after Auschwitz, it is more about everything in general. Very interesting book. I'm sure the museum has stocks of books, but in school you could get them perhaps as well in your library. Well, thank you very, very much. I'm ready there for all your questions.
Eva, that was extremely powerful and very moving, and thank you for sharing it. We have had a lot of questions come in. We've also had a lot of people saying thank you for sharing your story in the comments. And so I'm actually going to start with a question from Tiffany, and she wants to know, have you ever gone back to Auschwitz-Birkenau since the war ended?
Yes, I had no intention ever to set foot near this place. But in 1995, when it became for the first time, so after 40 years being really under Poland and Russian, the West was not able to go there, and it was kept how it was. And but in 1995, it became open, and it was the first time that the Western countries were going to have a big memorial service there. And they asked me, I lived in London at the time, they asked me if I could go and do a program for television. And I said, no, thank you. They said, well, I thought you would say that, but I'm sure you changed your mind. And I did change my mind, because they told me the Russian soldiers who had liberated the camp, some of them would be there, and I could say a thank you to them. And this is because I definitely owe my life to the Russians. If they wouldn't have come in January, I wouldn't have been alive. So I did go and with my husband, and it was a horrible, horrible experience. A few years later, I went with a German television group, and by that time I'd been strong enough to be able to cope with it. And a few years ago with a Japanese television group. So, so everybody can see me in all those different countries in the different languages to have this interview about going to Auschwitz and seeing that. And it has become now a big, big tourist area.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And kind of going along with that question, Judith wants to know, when did you start sharing your story with people about the Holocaust?
The first one I started to speak, I didn't share it with my family, nor with my husband. Of course, Otto becomes the children's grandfather, and so they knew, and he talked all the time about Anne, but he didn't say why or what. So the children were always puzzled about it. It was even a little bit of a problem for them, because who is this Anne? If she did something wrong, he always said, look, Anne would have done it this way. That is better, Who is this girl? And in their home was everything full of pictures of Anne and so on. But Otto never explained to them that he had lost his daughters. And what did you ask me?
When Eva, did you start sharing your story with people?
And the hiding place of the Franks became a museum. You can go there, not now with the COVID, but you can go there. It's a beautiful museum. They show a lot of things. And so now I've forgotten again. So,
that's okay.
And they made, in 1986, they make a traveling exhibition because they realized not everybody can come to Amsterdam. And the first one came to London in 1986. And of course I was invited, and I was not a speaker, I was shy, I was a very shy person. And but the organizer said, come and sit at the head table. I said, okay, I'll sit there. And at the end, after many people had spoken about the importance of learning about the Holocaust, because till the 80s, it wasn't really much known about it. And at the end, he said, and now, Eva, we want to tell you something. I wanted to hide under the table. I was in shock. There were 200 eyes looking up at me, and was terrible. And eventually, I think I did tell something, but of course, a bit here, a bit there, not the full story. But that was for me the first time that I had spoken, and the first night that I slept without having nightmares. Because if you keep it to yourself, it comes out at night. I always dreamt about things. But after I spoke, and then this exhibition traveled all over England, so is as well one in America, even a few of them. And so they asked me always to speak, to go to different places. And so I started to become a speaker. And then people said, well, you have such an interesting story, you should really write a book. And so the first book, Eva's Story, came out in 1988. So it is now already nearly 25 years old.
So you have been sharing your story now for a while. And again, we really thank you for sharing it with us today. We have a lot of people who are asking so they can see the pictures of your brother's paintings in your books, correct?
Yeah, there are some, but we are working now, it is very interesting, on a Zoom production of a new play, which should come out very soon, which the paintings will all be shown in it. So I can let you know here at the museum when this Zoom play will be available. And as well, I work with a friend, an American friend who lives here, on an animation film about my brother's life and his artwork. So, and the original, because there were 30 paintings, I donated in 2006, I think, to the Resistance Museum in Amsterdam. I told you resistance country had a lot of people who hated to be occupied by the Nazis, and many were shot, many were killed. And there's a big museum in Amsterdam, and my story is there with the paintings as well. So if ever later in your life you go to Amsterdam, please look at the Anne Frank house, and of course in the Resistance Museum.
I have not been there, but it is on my list of things to do when travel starts to open up again. And so Lisa, on that same subject, wants to know, did you ever see anyone or from the resistance or anyone who hid you and your family ever again after the war?
Yeah, yes, the people where we were arrested in the house, this was an elderly couple, and it is very interesting to tell, but I've really got much time. But my mother had a powder box there where we were staying, and in it, in the back, you could unscrew the lid, the bottom, and we had some jewelry hidden there because father didn't earn, and he had some jewelry which we sold from time to time through the resistance. And my father and those people were of course arrested as well, an elderly couple, and they would never have survived anything. And so my father did a bargain with the Nazis. He said, if I tell you where I have some jewelry hidden, would you let those people go? And they did that. So they picked up the powder box, they went back to this house, picked up the powder box, he pocketed it, and he let those people go.
Wow. I did not know.
And of course, after the war, we were very friendly with those people, very pleased that they had survived and so on. And she was an artist, and she gave me actually painting lessons because I was so nervous and so depressed, and they thought if you do some art, that will relax you. And I have actually one very nice picture, which is which I painted at the time, but not as nice as my brother, just a still life.
That is I did not know that you yourself were an artist. So that's awesome. So we only have time for a few more questions. We don't want to keep you. So Angel asks, did you have any friends while you were in the camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau?
Not really, people were much too busy. First of all, we had never time really to talk with each other. We worked the whole day till late at night, and then there was a roll call, 2 hours standing in the morning and in the evening. And we were exhausted, so we just fell on our bed, and that was it. There was not much help to each other, everybody just tried to survive for themselves. And that was part of the system, they made life so hard for people that people lost we don't really look after other people anymore. That was part of the system to make us, inhuman.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And we know it's not easy. So we have time for 2 more questions. The second to last question from Jane. What do you attribute to your survival? Or who do you attribute your survival to, if you had to pick someone?
Well, partly it was luck, So again, I didn't have time, but it's all in the book. Little things which helped me again to go through it. And then a very amazing thing was that we met in the camp. And it was enormous, and there was A, B, C camp, everything surrounded by electrified barbed wire. That my mother met a cousin of hers who had been from Prague, has been taken to Auschwitz, and she worked with this Dr. Mengele. And she really, that's all in the book, but it's a too long story. She saved my mother's life, and actually my life as well, because if I wouldn't have had my mother back, my mother was selected to be killed but she was saved. Amazing story, unbelievable story. And we were reunited in the end before the Russians came. If I would have been on my own, I would have gone on the death march and certainly not have survived. And as I say, the first instant with the head, if my mother wouldn't have given me that, I would have been selected and not have survived. So a lot depended on little, and I was very lucky that I had just little incidences which saved my life.
And to those of you out there watching, we will send out a link to where you can find Eva's books after. It is also already in the chat, I have been told. So if you look in the chat, there are links to Eva's books. And so I want to end it first by telling you, Eva, there are students all over the country saying hello. We actually have a group from Mexico City that wants to say hello to you. But if we want to leave it with, what would you say to students who are learning about this? You know, why is it still important years and years after World War II and the Holocaust to still learn about this subject, which is not easy to talk about?
Well, you know, there are unfortunately still quite a lot of Nazis, because they say from the camp, the young men who were the guards escaped, and they still believe, people still believe that Hitler was wonderful, and they deny that the Holocaust ever happened. And if we don't believe that this can have happened, can it happen? You know, people are not improving themselves. But if you read the story, if you go and ever visit this camp, if you see what has happened, if you read it, if you look at pictures, if you see, you realize that there was so much evil, and we have to stop this. Now, if you watch the news, you can see again terrible things happening in Yemen, in this country, in that country. Children are dying because also people fight them. They take away their food. You know, it's terrible. And we are very lucky. We have given a wonderful space to live, a globe. It provides everything for us. We have food, we have water, we have you know, we have beautiful sky, we have seas, we have fish, we have animals, we have everything. And appreciate that. And don't grab things from other people and hate them because they look a little bit different. Or, you know, we are all human beings and we should all be treated equally. And as well, you know, I'm not a communist by no means, but you know, there are people who have millions, heaps of millions, can never ever use it, and other people haven't even got a home to go and sleep in a tent or under a blanket, under a door. You know, there's so much inequality. We have to change that. Everybody has a right to a decent living and enough food. So, you know, we have to talk about that. We have to educate the people to be more generous, to help each other, to be humane. That's what we are. We are human beings, meaning that we help each other. We help the human race, and not just some people have everything. We have to be more generous with what we have and share everything.
Well, you guys heard it out there. She's called, there's a call to action, not to be a bystander, but to be an upstander. And so with that, again, thank everybody for joining us today. Like I said, we had students in Canada, I heard from Ontario, all over the United States. And so Eva Schloss, we really appreciate.
Well, bye-bye. Perhaps one day I come near your school. I hope still that this COVID is finished, that I will be able to travel, and perhaps I come and speak at your school.
Yes, bye. Thank you all for joining us.
Bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye.